I spent 18 months planning every detail of my granddaughter's wedding, from hand-selecting each rose in her bouquet to secretly paying for the photographer she thought was beyond her budget. What I didn't plan for was standing in that elegant ballroom, surrounded by 200 guests, watching the girl I'd raised since she was 3 years old look me dead in the eye and announce to everyone that I was too embarrassing to sit at the family table. By the end of that night, she would discover that the grandmother she thought she knew had been hiding the most devastating secret of our family's history, and that everything she believed about her perfect wedding had been built on a foundation of lies I'd been protecting her from her entire life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Sofia's wedding started at 4:30, just like I'd planned it would. I'd been awake since 3, actually, sitting in my small kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sunrise paint the sky the exact shade of blush pink I'd chosen for the bridesmaid dresses. At 73, I'd learned that sleep becomes optional when your heart is too full of anticipation to rest. This wasn't just any wedding. This was Sofia's wedding, my only granddaughter, the child who had been the center of my universe since the day her parents died in that car accident 20 years ago. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and for the past 2 decades, I had been both grandmother and mother to Sofia Chen-Hartwell, a brilliant, ambitious girl who had grown into a successful marketing executive with a corner office and a fiancé who treated her like a queen. I had raised her in my modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, working double shifts at the hospital where I'd been a nurse for 47 years, making sure she never felt the absence of her parents in any way that mattered. Every dance recital, every parent-teacher conference, every midnight fever and broken heart, I had been there. The wedding was being held at the Grand Meridian, the most exclusive venue in our city, with crystal chandeliers that cost more than my annual salary and a ballroom that overlooked the harbor. Sofia had dreamed of getting married there since she was 15, when I'd taken her to a charity gala, and she'd pressed her nose against the windows, whispering that someday she'd dance in that room on the most important day of her life. What she didn't know was that I'd been saving every penny since that moment, working overtime shifts and skipping vacations, building a secret wedding fund that would make her childhood dream come true. I arrived at the venue at 6 in the morning, 3 hours before anyone else, carrying the hand-sewn ring-bearer pillow I'd embroidered with Sofia's initials and those of her fiancé, Marcus. The pillow had taken me 6 months to complete, working by lamplight after my hospital shifts, using silk thread I'd ordered from a specialty shop in San Francisco. Every stitch was a prayer for their happiness, every tiny seed pearl a wish for their future. It was one of 7 items I'd handcrafted for this wedding, including the lace handkerchief I'd tatted for Sofia to carry, made from thread that had belonged to my own grandmother. The venue coordinator, a sharp-dressed woman named Vivian, met me in the lobby with a clipboard and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. She'd been polite but distant during our meetings, the kind of professional courtesy that made it clear she thought a grandmother paying for a wedding at the Grand Meridian was slightly ridiculous. Sofia had introduced me as the one handling the financial arrangements, but I could tell Vivian assumed there was family money somewhere, perhaps a trust fund or an inheritance. She never asked questions about how a retired nurse could afford a $60,000 wedding, and I never offered explanations. I spent the morning overseeing the flower arrangements, checking that the ivory roses were arranged exactly as I'd requested, with baby's breath and eucalyptus trailing down the sides of each centerpiece. The florist, a kind woman named Maria, who had worked with me for months, squeezed my hand when she saw me examining each table. "Everything is perfect, Eleanor," she said softly. "Sofia is going to be so happy." I nodded, but there was a knot in my stomach that had been growing tighter with each passing hour. Something felt different about Sofia lately, a distance that I couldn't quite name. For the past 3 months, ever since Marcus had proposed, Sofia had been spending more and more time with his family, particularly his mother, Patricia Whitmore. Patricia was everything I wasn't: wealthy, well-connected, with a sprawling estate in the hills and a social calendar that read like a who's who of the city's elite. She had immediately taken Sofia under her wing, introducing her to country clubs and charity committees, hosting brunch parties where Sofia met the wives of CEOs and city council members. I had been happy for Sofia at first, thrilled that she was forming connections and expanding her social circle. But lately, I'd noticed changes. The way she corrected my grammar when I spoke to her friends, the expensive clothes that appeared in her closet, gifts from Patricia that made my carefully saved purchases from department store sales look shabby in comparison. The subtle comments about how I might want to update my look for the wedding, how important it was to make a good impression on Marcus's family and their friends. The most painful change had been the gradual exclusion from wedding planning decisions. Initially, Sofia had included me in everything, asking my opinion on dress styles and cake flavors, excitedly showing me Pinterest boards filled with her vision for the perfect day. But as Patricia became more involved, my input became less welcome. Decisions that we had made together were quietly changed. The rustic outdoor ceremony Sofia and I had planned became an elaborate indoor affair at Patricia's suggestion. The simple buffet dinner became a 5-course plated meal. The local DJ we'd hired was replaced with a string quartet and live band that cost more than my monthly salary. Each change came with an explanation that made perfect sense. The Grand Meridian was more elegant, more appropriate for Marcus's family. The upgraded menu would photograph better for the society pages. The professional musicians would create the sophisticated atmosphere that their friends expected. Sofia presented each modification as an improvement, a way to make their wedding truly special, but I could hear Patricia's voice in every justification. By 10 in the morning, the bridal suite was buzzing with activity. Sofia's college friends had arrived, along with Marcus's sisters and their mother, all of them carrying expensive makeup cases and champagne bottles with custom labels. I knocked on the door, carrying the garment bag that held my dress for the evening, a navy blue silk gown I'd purchased specifically for this occasion. It was the most expensive piece of clothing I'd ever owned, chosen after weeks of careful shopping and saved for with months of overtime pay. Sofia opened the door wearing a white silk robe, her hair already pinned in elaborate curls by the professional stylist Patricia had hired. She looked absolutely radiant, glowing with the kind of happiness that makes a person beautiful from the inside out. For a moment, all my worries melted away. This was my granddaughter, the little girl who used to climb into my lap for bedtime stories, who called me Nana and told me she loved me every single night. "Nana!" she exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and hairspray. "You're here early. We're just getting started with hair and makeup." She gestured toward the room, where Patricia was directing the photographer and the other women were chatting over mimosas. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Patricia brought a whole team. Isn't this amazing? I smiled and nodded, though something about the scene felt overwhelming. The room was full of people I barely knew, all of them speaking in the kind of casual shorthand that comes from years of shared experiences and inside jokes. Patricia looked up from her conversation with the photographer and gave me a polite smile, the kind reserved for service providers and distant relatives. "Eleanor, how lovely to see you," she said, her voice carrying the trained warmth of someone accustomed to social situations. "Sofia looks absolutely stunning, doesn't she? We're just putting the finishing touches on everything." The way she said "we" made it clear that I was not included in that group, despite the fact that I had paid for nearly everything in the room, from the photographer to the champagne to the elaborate flower arrangements that decorated every surface. Sofia didn't seem to notice the subtle exclusion, caught up as she was in the excitement of the moment. She pulled me toward the window, where her wedding dress hung in all its glory, a confection of ivory silk and French lace that had cost more than I'd spent on clothing in the past 5 years combined. "Isn't it perfect, Nana?" she whispered, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "I can't believe this day is finally here." I agreed that it was perfect, because it was. The dress, the venue, the flowers, every detail had been carefully chosen and lovingly arranged. What I didn't say was that it had all been paid for with money I'd been saving since her high school graduation, funds that were supposed to ensure my own security in retirement but had been gladly sacrificed to give her this moment of absolute perfection. The photographer, a young man with an expensive camera and an easy smile, began organizing group shots of the bridal party. I found myself gently pushed to the periphery, holding purses and adjusting lighting while Patricia coordinated poses and made suggestions about angles. When the photographer suggested including me in some family photos, Patricia quickly intervened, with the explanation that they wanted to save the grandmother pictures for later, when Sofia was fully dressed and ready. As the morning progressed, I began to feel increasingly invisible, a piece of furniture that served a function but wasn't really part of the scene. The conversation flowed around me, full of references to people and places I didn't know, stories about vacations in Europe and shopping trips to New York. When I tried to contribute, sharing a memory of Sofia's childhood or making a comment about the wedding preparations, the responses were polite but brief, conversation stoppers rather than invitations to participate further. The moment that should have been the highlight of my morning came when Sofia was finally ready to put on her dress. I had been looking forward to this for months, imagining myself helping her with the buttons and the veil, sharing a quiet moment together before she walked down the aisle. Instead, I found myself standing in the corner while Patricia and the stylist fussed over every detail, adjusting the bodice and arranging the train while Sofia looked at herself in the full-length mirror with wonder. "You look like a princess," Patricia murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Marcus is going to be absolutely speechless." Sofia turned to hug her future mother-in-law, tears streaming down her face in a way that somehow didn't disturb her carefully applied makeup. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." I stood there holding my breath, waiting for Sofia to turn to me next, to acknowledge the sacrifices that had made this day possible. Instead, she caught sight of herself in the mirror again and became absorbed in adjusting her veil, lost in the magic of the moment. Patricia caught my eye over Sofia's shoulder and gave me a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement one might give to a helpful vendor who had done their job adequately. The next few hours passed in a blur of final preparations and last-minute adjustments. I found small ways to be useful, fetching water and holding things, making sure the photographer captured the moments that mattered. But increasingly, I felt like an observer rather than a participant, watching my granddaughter's wedding unfold from the sidelines rather than being at the center of the celebration. The ceremony itself was everything Sofia had dreamed it would be. The ballroom had been transformed into a garden wonderland, with thousands of white flowers and soft lighting that made everyone look like they were glowing. Sofia walked down the aisle on the arm of Marcus's father, since she had no father of her own to give her away, and I watched from the third row, surrounded by Marcus's relatives and family friends. For a moment, as Sofia passed my row, our eyes met, and she gave me a small smile that was meant just for me. In that instant, all the morning's disappointments faded away. This was what mattered: her happiness, her joy, the fact that she was beginning a new chapter of her life surrounded by love and beauty. I had made this possible, even if no one else knew the extent of my contribution. The ceremony was beautiful, filled with personal vows that made everyone cry, and music that swelled at exactly the right moments. When the minister pronounced them, husband and wife, the entire room erupted in applause, and I found myself wiping away tears of pure joy. Sofia looked radiant, Marcus looked devoted, and for those perfect moments, Everything felt exactly as it should be. The reception began immediately after the ceremony, with cocktails served in the adjacent salon while the ballroom was prepared for dinner. I mingled politely with the other guests, making small talk with Marcus's relatives and Sofia's college friends, most of whom I had met at various engagement parties and pre-wedding events. The conversations were pleasant but superficial, the kind of social interactions that fill time without creating real connections. I was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of white wine and watching Sofia laugh with her new husband, when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. Two of Marcus's aunts were talking quietly near the window, their voices low but not quite low enough to be completely private. I have to say, Patricia has done an amazing job managing this whole situation, one of them was saying. The poor girl had no idea how to plan a proper wedding. Can you imagine if they'd gone with her original ideas? Some backyard barbecue with a DJ from Craigslist? The other woman laughed softly. Patricia said the grandmother was actually going to pay for the whole thing herself, a nurse's retirement savings for a wedding at the Grand Meridian. It would have been embarrassing for everyone involved. Thank goodness Patricia stepped in and showed them how things should be done. My wine glass nearly slipped from my hand. I stood there frozen, listening to them discuss my financial situation and my granddaughter's wedding, as if they were analyzing a charity case that had been successfully managed by Patricia's intervention. But what they were saying didn't make sense. I had paid for the wedding. Every vendor, every expense, every detail had been charged to the account I had set up specifically for this purpose. The grandmother seems sweet, the first woman continued, but completely out of her depth. Patricia said she had to very diplomatically handle the situation, making sure the girl understood what was appropriate for their social circle. Can you imagine the embarrassment if Marcus's colleagues had shown up to some budget affair? I excused myself quietly and made my way to the ladies' room, where I could think clearly without the noise and chaos of the reception. Something was very wrong here. These women seemed to believe that Patricia had paid for the wedding, or at least managed the finances in some way that prevented embarrassment. But I had the bank statements and receipts that proved otherwise. I had personally written checks for every major expense, from the venue deposit to the final payment for the flowers, unless my mind began racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. I pulled out my phone and quickly accessed my online banking, something I rarely did but had learned to navigate out of necessity. The wedding account I had set up showed exactly what I expected: a balance near zero, with months of deposits from my paychecks and systematic withdrawals for wedding expenses. But as I scrolled through the recent transactions, I noticed something odd. Several of the largest payments, including the final balance for the venue and the catering, showed as having been refunded or credited back to my account, only to be immediately transferred out again to an account I didn't recognize. The dates of these transactions were recent, within the past 2 weeks, well after I thought all the payments had been finalized. My hands were shaking as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked as though someone had systematically refunded my payments and then replaced them with payments from another source, but in a way that would not be immediately obvious, unless someone was looking specifically for discrepancies. The timing suggested that this had happened after I thought everything was settled, during the final weeks when I had been focused on the personal details rather than the financial arrangements. I needed to understand what was happening, but the ladies' room of an elegant reception was not the place to conduct a financial investigation. I splashed cold water on my face, checked my appearance in the mirror, and returned to the reception with what I hoped was a calm expression. But inside, my mind was churning with questions and a growing sense of unease. The cocktail hour was winding down, and guests were beginning to move into the ballroom for dinner. I found my assigned seat at a table near the back of the room, surrounded by people I didn't know well, including several of Marcus's work colleagues and their spouses. It was not the family table where I had expected to sit, but I told myself it didn't matter. What mattered was that Sofia was happy and that the evening was unfolding beautifully. Sofia and Marcus made their grand entrance as husband and wife, and the room erupted in applause and cheers. They looked absolutely perfect together, radiant with joy and clearly deeply in love. Sofia had changed into a different dress for the reception, a sleek column of beaded silk that caught the light with every movement. She was glowing in a way that made her look almost ethereal, and I felt a surge of fierce pride and love watching her embrace this moment. The dinner service began with a series of toasts from family and friends. Marcus's father spoke eloquently about welcoming Sofia into their family and his hopes for their future happiness. Sofia's college roommate shared funny stories about their adventures together and how Sofia had always dreamed of finding true love. Several of Marcus's friends offered witty and heartfelt remarks about their friendship and the joy of seeing him so happy. I kept expecting to be invited to speak, to offer the grandmother's blessing that would traditionally be part of such an occasion. I had even prepared some remarks, thinking about what I wanted to say about watching Sofia grow from a grieving 3-year-old into the accomplished, loving woman she had become. But as the toasts continued and the evening progressed, it became clear that I was not going to be called upon to speak. Instead, the final toast came from Patricia, who rose gracefully from her seat at the head table and spoke about the joy of gaining a daughter and her pride in the beautiful celebration they had all created together. Her words were warm and heartfelt, and she spoke about Sofia with genuine affection and admiration. But as I listened, I began to understand that Patricia's toast was being received as the words of the person who had made this evening possible, the maternal figure who had guided Sofia through the wedding planning process and ensured that everything was perfect. The applause for Patricia's toast was long and enthusiastic, and I watched as Sofia stood to hug her new mother-in-law with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for everything," Sofia said into the microphone, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I never could have imagined anything this beautiful. You've given me the wedding of my dreams." I felt something break inside my chest, a sharp pain that had nothing to do with my 73-year-old body and everything to do with watching my granddaughter credit someone else with the sacrifices I had made. But I told myself it didn't matter. Sofia was happy. The wedding was beautiful, and in the end, that was what counted. I didn't need recognition or applause. I just needed to know that I had given her this gift, even if she never understood the true cost. The evening continued, with dancing and more celebration. Sofia and Marcus had their first dance to a song by a jazz singer I didn't recognize, something elegant and sophisticated that Patricia had undoubtedly chosen. I watched from my table, applauding and smiling, trying to focus on the joy of the moment rather than the growing confusion and hurt that was building in my chest. During the dancing, I finally had a chance to approach Sofia and congratulate her properly. She hugged me tightly, and for a moment, it felt like we were back in my kitchen on Maple Street, just the two of us against the world. "Nana, isn't this incredible?" she said, gesturing around the ballroom with obvious delight. "I feel like I'm living in a fairy tale. Everything is so perfect, so elegant. Marcus's family has been amazing, especially Patricia. I don't know how I got so lucky." I agreed that she was very lucky and that the wedding was indeed perfect. But something in my expression must have betrayed my complicated feelings because Sofia's smile faltered slightly. "Is everything okay, Nana? You look tired. Maybe you should sit down." Before I could respond, Patricia appeared at Sofia's elbow, smiling brightly and carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "There you are, darling," she said to Sofia. "The photographer wants to get some shots of you and Marcus with the cake before we do the cutting ceremony." She handed Sofia a glass and then seemed to notice me for the first time. "Eleanor, how are you enjoying the evening? Isn't it wonderful how everything came together?" Well, there was something in her tone, a subtle emphasis on the phrase "came together," that made me look at her more carefully. Patricia was smiling, but there was something calculating in her eyes, something that suggested she was very aware of the undercurrents in this conversation. "It's a beautiful wedding," I said carefully. "Sofia looks absolutely radiant." "She does indeed," Patricia agreed. "We're so pleased with how everything turned out. It takes a village to create something this special, doesn't it? So many people working together to make dreams come true." Again, there was something in her phrasing that felt loaded with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. Sofia, oblivious to the subtle tension between the adults, kissed my cheek and hurried off with Patricia to meet the photographer. I watched them go, Patricia's hand on Sofia's elbow in a gesture that was both supportive and possessive. I spent the rest of the evening observing rather than participating, trying to piece together the puzzle of what was happening around me. The more I watched and listened, the more I began to understand that there were two completely different narratives about this wedding circulating among the guests. In one version, the one that seemed to be accepted by Marcus's family and friends, Patricia had essentially rescued Sofia from an embarrassing situation, stepping in to ensure that the wedding was appropriate for their social circle and managing the financial arrangements to prevent any awkwardness. In the other version, the one that existed only in my own experience, I had sacrificed my retirement security to give my granddaughter the wedding of her dreams, working overtime for 2 years and spending every spare penny to make this evening possible. The truth, I was beginning to suspect, lay somewhere in between these two narratives, in a complicated web of arrangements and agreements that I didn't fully understand, but was beginning to fear had left me both financially responsible and completely excluded from recognition. As the evening drew to a close, I found myself standing alone near the edge of the dance floor, watching Sofia dance with her new husband. They looked so happy, so perfectly matched, so completely absorbed in each other and in the magic of their wedding night. This was what I had wanted for her, what I had worked so hard to provide. A perfect beginning to her new life, surrounded by beauty and love and hope for the future. But as I watched, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had been taken from me in the process, something more important than money or recognition. It felt as though the relationship I had built with Sofia over 20 years, the bond between grandmother and granddaughter that had been forged through shared struggles and mutual devotion, had been somehow rewritten to cast me as a minor character in her story rather than the person who had shaped her into the woman she had become. The band announced the last dance, and couples filled the floor for a final romantic moment. I gathered my purse and began to make my way toward the exit, planning to say my goodbyes and slip away quietly while Sofia and Marcus were still absorbed in the celebration. Tomorrow, I would figure out what had happened with the financial arrangements and what it meant for my own future. Tonight, I just wanted to go home to my quiet house on Maple Street and process everything that had happened. But as I reached the edge of the ballroom, I heard Sofia's voice calling my name. I turned to see her hurrying toward me, her beaded dress catching the light and her face flushed with happiness and champagne. "Nana, you're not leaving, are you?" she asked, slightly out of breath. "The night's not over yet. Marcus and I want to talk to everyone before people start going home." I assured her that I was just getting some air and would be back in a moment. But something in my expression must have given away my emotional state, because Sofia's smile faded and she studied my face with concern. "Are you okay? You've seemed quiet all evening. I hope you're having a good time." I was about to reassure her that everything was fine when Patricia appeared again, as she seemed to do whenever Sofia and I had a moment alone together. This time she was accompanied by Marcus and several other family members, all of them clearly preparing for some kind of announcement or presentation. "Perfect timing," Patricia said brightly. "We were just about to do the final thank yous before people start heading home." She gestured toward the center of the dance floor, where Marcus was tapping his champagne glass to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus called out, his voice carrying easily over the diminishing crowd, "before this incredible evening comes to an end, Sofia and I wanted to take a moment to thank the people who made it possible. The remaining guests gathered around the dance floor, and I found myself swept along with them, standing toward the back of the group with my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't entirely name. Sofia and Marcus stood in the center, holding hands and beaming at their friends and family. First and foremost, Sofia began, her voice clear and strong, we want to thank my mother-in-law, Patricia, who has been absolutely incredible throughout this entire process. She turned toward Patricia with tears in her eyes. Patricia, you took me under your wing and showed me what it means to be part of a real family. You helped me understand how to do this properly, how to create something beautiful and meaningful. I honestly don't know what I would have done without your guidance and your generosity. The crowd applauded enthusiastically, and I watched as Patricia stepped forward to accept a beautifully wrapped gift box from Sofia. As she opened it, I could see that it contained an expensive piece of jewelry, something that sparkled under the ballroom lights and drew admiring comments from the other women nearby. This is just a small token, Sofia continued, of our appreciation for everything you've done, for believing in us, for supporting us, and for making tonight absolutely perfect. Marcus took the microphone next and spoke about his gratitude to his parents for their love and support, and to his friends for their friendship and encouragement. He thanked the vendors and the venue staff, and he spoke movingly about how blessed he felt to be starting this new chapter of his life surrounded by so much love. I kept waiting for my name to be mentioned, for some acknowledgement of my role in making this evening possible. Surely Sofia would want to thank the grandmother who had raised her, who had sacrificed everything to give her this perfect wedding. But as the thank yous continued and the list of acknowledgments grew longer, it became increasingly clear that I was not going to be mentioned. Finally, Sofia took the microphone for the last time. And of course, she said, her voice warming, with obvious affection, we want to thank my grandmother Eleanor for being here tonight and for all the love and support she's given me over the years. The words should have been a relief, but instead they felt like a polite afterthought, the kind of generic appreciation one might express to a distant relative who had attended the wedding but hadn't been significantly involved in its planning or execution. The applause was brief and polite, and then Sofia was moving on to final comments about how wonderful the evening had been and how grateful she and Marcus were to everyone who had celebrated with them. As the crowd began to disperse, and people started saying their final goodbyes, I felt a strange disconnection from everything happening around me. It was as though I was watching the scene through glass, observing the end of my granddaughter's wedding from a distance that had nothing to do with physical space and everything to do with emotional isolation. Sofia was surrounded by well-wishers and family members, all of them eager to share final hugs and congratulations before the evening officially ended. I watched her laugh and cry and accept compliments on how beautiful everything had been, how perfectly organized, how elegant and sophisticated. Over and over, I heard people praising Patricia for her excellent taste and her obvious devotion to Sofia, commenting on how lucky Sofia was to have such a wonderful mother-in-law who had clearly spared no expense to make this day special. Each comment felt like a small knife twisting in my chest, not because I begrudged Patricia the praise she was receiving, but because I was beginning to understand that somehow, in some way I didn't yet fully comprehend, the narrative of this wedding had been rewritten to exclude my contributions entirely. In the story that everyone else seemed to believe, I was simply the grandmother who had attended the wedding, while Patricia was the maternal figure who had made it all possible. I was still standing there, trying to process what was happening, when Sofia finally broke away from the crowd and approached me. She looked tired but blissfully happy, her makeup slightly smudged and her hair beginning to escape from its elaborate style. For a moment, she looked exactly like the little girl who used to fall asleep in my lap after long days at the hospital, exhausted but content and completely trusting in my ability to take care of everything. Nana, she said, reaching for my hands. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I know this was all probably a little overwhelming for you, with so many people you don't know and everything being so formal. But it meant the world to me to have you here. Her words were meant to be kind, but they landed like a physical blow. She was speaking to me as though I were an elderly relative who had been graciously included in a celebration that was fundamentally beyond my understanding or involvement. There was no recognition of the sacrifices I had made, no acknowledgement of the 20 years I had spent raising her or the 2 years I had spent planning and saving for this exact moment. I'm so glad. You enjoyed yourself, I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and distant even to my own ears. You looked absolutely beautiful tonight, sweetheart. I hope you and Marcus will be very happy together. Sophia hugged me tightly, and for a moment, the familiar warmth of our relationship seemed to return. I love you, Nana, she whispered. Thank you for everything you've done for me over the years. I know I haven't always been the easiest person to raise, but you never made me feel like a burden. You gave me such a good life. Her words were clearly meant to acknowledge our shared history, but somehow they felt like a closing statement, a final thank you that wrapped up our relationship in past tense rather than establishing the foundation for our future. It was as though she was thanking me for my service as her guardian and caretaker, a job that was now complete and no longer necessary. You were never a burden, I told her, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Raising you has been the greatest privilege of my life. You've brought me more joy than you'll ever know. Sophia pulled back to look at me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, some recognition of the weight of what we were both feeling. But then Marcus appeared at her shoulder, ready to escort her to their honeymoon suite upstairs, and the moment was lost. Ready to go, Mrs. Whitmore? He asked with a grin, using her new married name with obvious pleasure. Sophia giggled and nodded, then turned back to me for one final hug. I'll call you when we get back from Tuscany, she promised. I want to hear all about how you're settling back into your routine. Maybe we can have lunch and you can tell me what you really thought about tonight, when you're not being so polite. I assured her that I would love to have lunch and hear about her honeymoon, though something about the way she phrased the invitation made it sound like a social obligation rather than a natural continuation of our close relationship. She and Marcus headed toward the elevator that would take them to their bridal suite, surrounded by a small group of close friends and family members who were clearly planning to continue the celebration in a more intimate setting upstairs. I was not invited to join this final gathering, which didn't surprise me but somehow felt like the final confirmation of my new status in Sophia's life. I was the grandmother who had attended the wedding, not the family member who would be included in the most precious moments of the celebration. I gathered my things and made my way toward the exit, walking slowly through the now empty ballroom, where just hours earlier I had watched my granddaughter dance with pure joy. The venue staff was already beginning to clean up, removing centerpieces, and collecting discarded programs and champagne glasses. In a few hours, there would be no trace of this evening left behind, just memories and photographs, and the lingering scent of expensive flowers. As I waited for my taxi in the lobby of the Grand Meridian, I found myself thinking about the little girl who had moved into my house 20 years ago, clutching a stuffed elephant and crying for parents who would never come home. I had promised her that night that I would take care of her, that she would never have to worry about being alone or unloved as long as I was alive. I had kept that promise in every way I knew how. I had worked extra shifts to pay for dance lessons and summer camps. I had helped her with homework and driven her to friends' houses and sat in the emergency room when she broke her arm falling off her bike. I had celebrated every achievement and comforted every disappointment, and I had saved every penny I could spare to make sure she could have the wedding she dreamed of. But somehow, despite all of that history and sacrifice and love, I had ended the evening feeling like a stranger at my own granddaughter's wedding, watching her thank other people for gifts I had given and credit other people with support I had provided. I didn't understand how it had happened or what it meant for our future relationship, but I knew that something fundamental had changed between us, and I wasn't sure it could ever be changed back. The taxi arrived, and I gave the driver my address, on Maple Street. As we pulled away from the Grand Meridian, I turned back for one last look at the elegant building where my granddaughter had just had the most important night of her life. The windows of the ballroom were still lit, and I could see shadows moving inside as the cleanup continued. Tomorrow, I would have to figure out what had happened with the wedding finances and what it meant for my own future security. I would have to decide how to navigate this new dynamic with Sofia, and whether to try to correct the misunderstandings that seemed to have taken root around her wedding. But tonight, I just wanted to go home and try to make sense of how the most important day in my granddaughter's life had somehow become one of the most painful nights of my own. The taxi pulled into my driveway at 11:47, and I sat in the back seat for a long moment before paying the driver. My house looked exactly the same as it had when I'd left that morning, a modest 2-story with white shutters and the small garden I'd been tending for 30 years. But everything felt different now, as though the foundation had shifted while I was away, and nothing would ever quite fit together the same way again. I let myself in through the front door and stood in my living room, still wearing my expensive navy dress and the pearl earrings I'd bought specifically for this occasion. The house was quiet in a way that felt oppressive rather than peaceful, filled with the kind of silence that amplifies your own thoughts until they become overwhelming. I kicked off my heels and walked barefoot to the kitchen, where I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the small table where Sofia and I had shared thousands of meals over the years. The kitchen felt particularly empty that night, haunted by memories of birthday mornings and homework sessions and late-night conversations about boys and dreams and fears. This was where Sofia had told me she was valedictorian, where she'd cried over her first heartbreak, where she'd shown me Marcus's engagement ring with tears of joy streaming down her face. Every major moment of her life had been celebrated or mourned at this table, with me as her constant companion and support system. But tonight, for the first time in 20 years, Sofia was sleeping somewhere else, beginning a new life that apparently didn't require my presence or input. She was upstairs in the honeymoon suite at the Grand Meridian, surrounded by Marcus's family and friends, being welcomed into a world where I was at best a peripheral figure, and at worst an embarrassment to be managed and minimized. I sat there until nearly 2 a.m, trying to piece together the events of the evening and understand how so many small moments had added up to such a devastating conclusion. The more I thought about it, the more I began to see a pattern. In the interactions I had witnessed, a carefully orchestrated campaign to reposition me as an outsider in my own granddaughter's life. The morning after the wedding, I woke up with a determination that surprised me. Despite feeling emotionally drained and confused, I had slept better than I had in weeks, and I woke with a clarity that felt almost foreign after months of doubt and uncertainty. I needed answers about what had happened with the wedding finances, and I needed to understand the scope of whatever arrangements had been made without my knowledge. I spent the first hour of the day going through every piece of paperwork related to Sofia's wedding, organizing receipts and bank statements and contracts into neat piles on my kitchen table. What I found painted a picture that was both more complex and more disturbing than I had initially realized. The pattern I had noticed in my banking app the night before was even more extensive than I had thought. Over the course of the past 6 weeks, nearly every major payment I had made for the wedding had been systematically refunded and then replaced with payments from other sources. The venue deposit I had paid 8 months earlier had been refunded and repaid by someone else. The catering balance, the floral arrangements, the photography package, even the musicians had all been handled the same way. But the refunds hadn't come back to me directly. Instead, they had been processed through a series of transfers that ultimately moved the money into an account I didn't recognize. When I called my bank to inquire about these transactions, I was told that they had been authorized using my online banking credentials and appeared to be legitimate transfers to a family member's account. The customer service representative was helpful but limited in what she could tell me without proper documentation. She did confirm that the account receiving the transfers belonged to someone with the last name Whitmore, which made my stomach clench with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Patricia had somehow gained access to my banking information and had systematically replaced my wedding payments with her own, while redirecting my money to an account under her control. The implications were staggering. Not only had Patricia effectively stolen credit for paying for Sofia's wedding, but she had also managed to recoup her expenses by taking my money in the process. I had been left with all the financial burden and none of the recognition, while Patricia appeared to be both the generous benefactor and the practical manager of the situation. But how had she gained access to my banking information? I had been careful with my passwords and had never shared my login credentials with anyone. The only person who had ever had access to my financial information was Sofia, who had helped me set up online banking 2 years earlier and had occasionally assisted me with transfers and bill payments when I was working long shifts at the hospital. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Sofia must have given Patricia access to my banking information, either directly by sharing my login credentials or indirectly by helping Patricia navigate the transfers without understanding their true purpose. Either way, my own granddaughter had been instrumental in the systematic theft of my wedding contributions and the credit for my sacrifices. I spent the next several hours trying to construct alternative explanations for what had happened, desperately, hoping to find a scenario that didn't involve Sofia deliberately deceiving me. Perhaps Patricia had convinced her that consolidating the wedding payments under one account would be more efficient. Perhaps Sofia had thought she was helping me by allowing Patricia to take over the financial management of the wedding. Perhaps there had been some misunderstanding about who was supposed to pay for what, and Sofia had simply been trying to clarify the arrangements. But no matter how I tried to rationalize the situation, I kept coming back to the same uncomfortable truth. The transactions I was looking at had required deliberate coordination and planning. Someone had systematically identified every payment I had made, arranged for those payments to be refunded, and then replaced them with payments from Patricia's account, while redirecting my refunds to Patricia's control. This wasn't a misunderstanding, or a well-intentioned attempt to help. This was a carefully executed plan to steal both my money and my credit for Sofia's wedding. The question that haunted me was whether Sofia had been a willing participant in this plan, or simply a naive tool being manipulated by someone more sophisticated and ruthless. The Sofia I had raised was honest and loyal, incapable of deliberately hurting the person who had sacrificed everything for her well-being. But the Sofia I had observed at the wedding seemed like a different person, someone who was comfortable accepting credit for things she hadn't earned, and excluding the people who had actually made her happiness possible. By noon, I had documented every suspicious transaction and had compiled a file of evidence that clearly showed the pattern of financial manipulation. I had also started a timeline of events that traced the changes in Sofia's behavior and attitudes back to the beginning of her relationship with Marcus's family. What I saw was a gradual but systematic campaign to separate Sofia from her previous life and integrate her into a world where I was not welcome. The campaign had been subtle but effective. It had started with small suggestions about updating Sofia's wardrobe and social circle, gentle corrections of her grammar and etiquette, and invitations to events where she could meet the right kind of people. Over time, these influences had evolved into more direct interventions in her decision-making, with Patricia positioning herself as a mentor and mother figure who could guide Sofia toward a more sophisticated and appropriate lifestyle. The wedding planning had been the perfect vehicle for this transformation. By gradually taking over the financial and logistical aspects of the celebration, Patricia had been able to reposition herself as the person responsible for Sofia's happiness, while simultaneously marginalizing my role and contributions. The final stroke had been the systematic replacement of my payments with her own, ensuring that she would receive all the credit for the wedding's success while I was left feeling confused and excluded. What made the situation even more painful was the realization that Sofia had not only allowed this to happen, but had actively participated in it. The thank you speech at the reception hadn't been a momentary oversight or a nervous mistake. It had been the culmination of months of preparation, during which Sofia had been coached to see Patricia as her benefactor and me as a well-meaning but ultimately inadequate guardian whose time had passed. The phone rang at 2:30, startling me out of my analysis of the banking documents. The caller ID showed Sofia's number, and for a moment, my heart leaped with hope that she was calling to explain everything, to tell me that there had been some terrible misunderstanding that she was eager to correct. Instead, her voice was bright and cheerful, filled with the lingering excitement of her wedding night and the anticipation of her upcoming honeymoon. She talked enthusiastically about how perfect the evening had been, how beautiful everything had looked, and how grateful she was to everyone who had made it possible. Patricia was absolutely incredible, she gushed. I don't know how she managed to coordinate everything so perfectly. Every detail was exactly right, and she made it look so effortless. Marcus's whole family was impressed with how elegant everything was. Patricia said she's never seen a more beautiful wedding, and coming from someone with her experience, that really means something. I listened to her praise Patricia for several minutes before she seemed to remember that I had also been present at the wedding. And of course, Nana, it was so wonderful to have you there. I know the whole thing was probably a little overwhelming for you, with so many people you didn't know, and all the formal traditions. But you looked lovely in your dress, and I could tell you were enjoying yourself. Her tone was warm but condescending, the way someone might speak to an elderly relative who had been graciously included in an event beyond their usual social sphere. There was no recognition of my role in making the wedding possible, no acknowledgement of the sacrifices I had made, and no awareness that anything unusual had happened with the financial arrangements. I found myself at a crossroads in that conversation. I could confront Sofia directly about what I had discovered, demand explanations for the banking transactions, and the systematic exclusion from recognition. I could lay out all the evidence I had compiled and force her to account for her role in Patricia's manipulation. Or I could continue to play the role of the gracious grandmother, accepting my marginalization without complaint and allowing Sofia to begin her married life without the burden of knowing how deeply she had wounded the person who loved her most. The choice I made in that moment would determine the future of our relationship and possibly the rest of my life. If I confronted Sofia, I risked destroying whatever remained of our bond and losing her entirely. But if I remained silent, I would be accepting a new dynamic where I was expected to be grateful for whatever crumbs of attention and affection she chose to offer me. Sofia, I said carefully, I need to ask you about something. The wedding was beautiful, and I'm so happy that you had the day you dreamed of. But I'm a little confused about some of the financial arrangements. I've been looking at my bank statements, and there seem to be some discrepancies with the payments I made. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Sofia spoke again, her voice had changed. The cheerful excitement was gone, replaced by something cooler and more defensive. What kind of discrepancies? She asked. Well, it looks like many of the payments I made for the wedding were refunded and then repaid by someone else. I'm just trying to understand what happened and why my money was transferred to an account I don't recognize. Another pause, longer this time. When Sofia finally responded, her tone was carefully neutral, the way someone might speak when they were choosing their words very deliberately. Nana, Patricia helped us consolidate some of the payments to make the accounting easier for the vendors. There were a lot of different deposits and balances, and she thought it would be simpler if everything came from one source. She's handled a lot of high-end weddings, so she knows how these things usually work. But why was my money transferred to her account? If the goal was just to consolidate payments, why not leave my contributions in my account, and have her send her payments directly to the vendors. I don't really understand all the financial details, Sofia said, and I could hear irritation creeping into her voice. Patricia managed all of that because she has experience with these kinds of arrangements. The important thing is that everything got paid for, and the wedding was perfect. I thought you'd be happy that it all worked out so well. Her response told me everything I needed to know. Sofia was either completely aware of what had happened and was lying to cover it up, or she was so willfully ignorant of the financial manipulation that she didn't want to understand what Patricia had done. Either way, she was not going to acknowledge the wrongness of the situation or take any responsibility for her role in it. Sofia, I said, feeling a calmness descend over me that was more frightening than anger would have been. I spent 2 years saving for your wedding. I worked overtime shifts and skipped vacations and spent nearly every penny of my retirement savings to give you the celebration you dreamed of. I did it gladly because I love you and I wanted you to be happy. But I need you to understand what actually happened here. Nana, I know you contributed to the wedding, and Marcus and I are very grateful. But you have to understand that Patricia's connections and experience made it possible to have the wedding at the level we wanted. The vendors she works with, the relationships she has, the way she knows how to coordinate everything. Without her involvement, we never could have had something so elegant and sophisticated. The words felt like a slap. Sofia was telling me that my contributions had been insufficient, that without Patricia's intervention, the wedding would have been somehow lesser, embarrassing, inappropriate for the social circle Sofia now wanted to join. Are you saying that the wedding I planned for you wouldn't have been good enough? I asked. I'm saying that Patricia helped us understand what was appropriate for Marcus's family and their friends. She showed us how to do things the right way, how to make sure everything reflected the kind of people we want to be. I'm grateful for everything you've done for me over the years, but this was different. This was about starting my adult life in the right way. The right way. The phrase echoed in my mind as I realized that Sofia had fully absorbed Patricia's worldview, accepting the idea that there was a right way to live that was superior to the way I had raised her, and that my values and sacrifices were somehow inadequate preparation for her new life. I see, I said quietly. And in this right way of doing things, is it appropriate to take someone's money without their knowledge and give credit to someone else for their sacrifices? Nobody took your money, Nana. The wedding got paid for, just like it was supposed to. I don't understand why you're making this into such a big deal. Can't you just be happy that everything worked out beautifully? Her refusal to acknowledge the ethical problems with what had happened was more painful than anything else that had occurred. This was the granddaughter I had raised to value honesty and fairness, to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. But Patricia had successfully convinced her that different rules applied when you were moving in more elevated social circles, that the ends justified the means when the goal was achieving the kind of sophistication and status that Sofia now craved. I am happy that you had a beautiful wedding, I said. I'm just disappointed that you don't seem to understand what it cost me to give it to you, or what it means that someone else is getting credit for my sacrifices. I do understand, and I'm grateful. But gratitude doesn't mean I have to do things exactly the way you would do them. I'm an adult now, and I have to make decisions based on what's best for my marriage and my future. Patricia understands that world in a way that you just don't, and I need her guidance to navigate it successfully. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but it was clear that we were not going to reach any kind of understanding or resolution. Sofia had made her choice to align herself with Patricia's values and worldview, and she was not interested in examining the ethical implications of that choice or acknowledging the harm it had caused me. When we finally hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling more alone than I had at any point since Sofia had first come to live with me 20 years earlier. The granddaughter I had raised with such love and sacrifice had become someone I barely recognized, someone who was willing to rationalize theft and deception in service of social advancement. But as painful as that realization was, it also brought a strange sense of clarity. I finally understood what I was dealing with, and I could stop torturing myself with false hope that this was all some terrible misunderstanding that could be easily resolved. Sofia had chosen her path, and she had chosen it knowingly and deliberately. The question now was what I was going to do about it. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching my legal options for recovering the money that had been taken from my accounts. The situation was complicated by the fact that the transactions had been authorized using my own banking credentials, which meant that from the bank's perspective, I had approved the transfers. But the fact that someone else had gained access to those credentials through deception might constitute fraud, even if proving that would be difficult. I also began to consider the broader implications of what had happened. Patricia's manipulation of the wedding finances was probably just the beginning of her campaign to control Sofia's life and separate her from any influences that might compete with Patricia's vision for Sofia's future. If I did nothing to challenge what had happened, I would be essentially giving Patricia permission to continue marginalizing my relationship with Sofia until I was reduced to the role of a distant relative who was occasionally invited to major life events but never consulted or included in meaningful ways. The phone rang again at 6:30, just as I was finishing a simple dinner of soup and toast. This time, the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard Patricia's smooth, cultured voice. "Eleanor, this is Patricia Whitmore. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." The fact that she was calling me at all was surprising, but the timing suggested that Sofia had told her about our earlier conversation and that Patricia was now attempting some form of damage control. "Hello, Patricia. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to thank you again for everything you did to make Sofia's wedding so special. She's told me how much your support has meant to her over the years, and I hope you know how grateful Marcus and I are for the role you've played in shaping her into such a wonderful young woman." Her tone was warm and sincere, but there was something calculated about her words, as though she were carefully managing a delicate situation rather than expressing genuine gratitude. "I'm glad Sofia was happy with the wedding," I said neutrally. "She was absolutely thrilled. Everything was exactly as she had dreamed it would be. And I have to say, I was so impressed with how gracefully you handled the whole celebration. I know it must have been overwhelming to see Sofia moving into a new phase of her life, but you showed such dignity and maturity in letting her transition into our family." The phrase, "letting her transition into our family," was particularly striking. Patricia was speaking as though my relationship with Sofia was something temporary that had now been completed, rather than a permanent bond that would continue throughout Sofia's life. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean by letting her transition," I said. "Well, you know how it is when young people get married. They need to establish their independence and create their own traditions. It can be difficult for the older generation to step back and allow that process to happen naturally. But you've been so understanding about giving Sofia the space she needs to grow into her new role as Marcus's wife." Patricia was essentially telling me that my diminished role in Sofia's life was natural and appropriate, and that I should be commended for accepting that marginalization gracefully, rather than fighting to maintain my previous relationship with my granddaughter. "Patricia," I said, deciding to address the situation directly, "I think there's been some confusion about the wedding finances. I've been looking at my bank statements and it appears that my payments were systematically replaced with yours. I'd like to understand how that happened." There was a pause, and when Patricia spoke again, her voice had lost some of its warmth. "Eleanor, I think Sofia may have mentioned that we helped consolidate some of the payments to make things easier for the vendors. When you're dealing with high-end service providers, they prefer to work with clients who understand their processes and can communicate effectively about complex arrangements. But my money was transferred to your account. How does that consolidate anything? The important thing is that everything got paid for properly and the wedding was executed at the level Sofia deserved." I understand that you had intended to contribute to the wedding, and your generosity was certainly appreciated. But given the complexity of the arrangements and the need to coordinate with vendors who have specific requirements, it made more sense for someone with experience in these matters to handle the actual transactions. Patricia was essentially admitting that she had taken over the wedding payments while dismissing my concerns about the financial manipulation as though they were petty complaints about procedural details rather than legitimate objections to theft. So you're saying that you decided I wasn't qualified to pay for my own granddaughter's wedding? I'm saying that Sofia's wedding required a level of sophistication and coordination that goes beyond simply writing checks. The vendors we used expect to work with clients who understand the social and cultural context of these events. It's not about qualification, it's about appropriateness. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Patricia maintaining her position that she had done nothing wrong and that her actions had been necessary to ensure Sofia's wedding met appropriate standards. She never denied taking my money, but she framed it as a reasonable management decision rather than acknowledging any ethical problems with her actions. What became clear during our conversation was that Patricia viewed me as fundamentally unsuitable to participate in Sofia's new life at any meaningful level. In her worldview, I was a working-class woman with limited education and social experience, who had served my purpose in raising Sofia, but was now an impediment to Sofia's advancement into more elevated social circles. Patricia's call had been intended to manage me, rather than to resolve the situation. She wanted to ensure that I understood my new place in the hierarchy and that I would accept my marginalization without causing problems for Sofia's integration into the Whitmore family and social circle. When we hung up, I felt a cold anger that was more energizing than anything I had experienced in months. Patricia had not only stolen my money and my credit for Sofia's wedding, but she was now attempting to gaslight me into believing that her actions had been reasonable and appropriate. The realization that both Sofia and Patricia expected me to quietly accept this treatment without complaint was the final catalyst I needed to decide on my course of action. I was not going to allow them to rewrite the history of Sofia's upbringing or to diminish my role in her life without a fight. I spent that evening making a series of phone calls and sending carefully worded emails to various people who had been involved in Sofia's wedding or who might have information about the financial arrangements. What I discovered was that Patricia's manipulation had been even more extensive than I had initially realized. The florist, Maria, told me that she had been surprised when Patricia had called to change the payment method for the flowers just days before the wedding. According to Maria, Patricia had explained that there had been a family emergency that required consolidating all wedding expenses under one account for insurance purposes. Maria had processed the refund and the new payment without question, assuming it was a routine administrative change. Similar conversations with the photographer and the caterer revealed the same pattern. In each case, Patricia had contacted the vendors in the final weeks before the wedding with plausible explanations for why the payment methods needed to be changed. The vendors had been happy to accommodate what appeared to be a reasonable request from someone who clearly had experience managing high-end events. What impressed me most about Patricia's execution was how carefully she had covered her tracks. Each vendor had been given a slightly different explanation for the payment changes, and the timing had been coordinated to avoid raising suspicions. If I hadn't been specifically looking for evidence of manipulation, the changes would have appeared to be routine administrative adjustments rather than part of a systematic campaign to steal credit for the wedding expenses. By 10 o'clock that night, I had compiled a comprehensive file documenting every aspect of Patricia's scheme. I had bank records showing the suspicious transfers, email correspondence with vendors confirming the last-minute payment changes, and a timeline that clearly demonstrated the coordinated nature of the manipulation. But more importantly, I had developed a plan for how to respond to what had been done to me. Patricia and Sofia had underestimated me, assuming that I would be too confused or intimidated to fight back effectively. They had also assumed that my love for Sofia would prevent me from taking any action that might cause her embarrassment or discomfort. They were wrong on both counts. The next morning, I woke up before dawn and began implementing the first phase of my response plan. I started by documenting everything that had happened in a detailed written account, including dates, times, and specific quotes from my conversations with Sofia and Patricia. I wanted to have a clear record of events that could be referenced later if necessary. I also began the process of securing my financial accounts and changing passwords for all my online services. Patricia's ability to access my banking information suggested that she had been given my credentials by Sofia, but I wanted to ensure that no further unauthorized transactions could take place. The most important step was scheduling appointments with both my attorney and my financial advisor to discuss the legal and practical implications of what had happened. I needed professional guidance about how to protect myself going forward, and what options I had for recovering the money that had been taken. My attorney, Robert Chen, was a family friend who had helped me with legal matters since my husband's death 15 years earlier. When I explained the situation to him, his expression grew increasingly serious, and by the time I finished, he was leaning back in his chair with a look of genuine concern. "Eleanor, what you're describing is a clear case of financial fraud," he said. "The fact that the transactions were processed using your credentials doesn't matter if those credentials were obtained through deception. Patricia's systematic replacement of your payments with her own, combined with the redirection of your money to her account, constitutes theft regardless of how sophisticated her methods were. But can I prove that Sofia gave her access to my banking information? We may not need to prove exactly how Patricia obtained your credentials. The pattern of transactions is so clearly fraudulent that a court would likely find in your favor based on the evidence you've already compiled. The question is whether you want to pursue criminal charges or focus on recovering your money through civil action." Robert explained that criminal prosecution would require involving law enforcement and potentially subjecting Sofia to questioning about her role in the scheme. Civil action would be less public, but might take longer to resolve and wouldn't necessarily result in Patricia facing any consequences beyond financial restitution. "There's also the question of what you hope to accomplish beyond recovering your money," Robert continued. "Are you trying to repair your relationship with Sofia, or are you prepared to accept that pursuing this matter might permanently damage that relationship?" It was a question I had been wrestling with since discovering the extent of Patricia's manipulation. Part of me still hoped that exposing the truth might shock Sofia into recognizing how badly she had treated me and lead to some kind of reconciliation. But a larger part of me had already accepted that the granddaughter I had raised was gone, replaced by someone who valued social status more than family loyalty, and who was willing to rationalize dishonesty in service of her ambitions. "I want my money back," I told Robert, "and I want Patricia to face consequences for what she's done. As for Sofia, I think our relationship is already damaged beyond repair. She's made her choice about what kind of person she wants to be, and I need to protect myself from further manipulation." Robert nodded and began explaining the legal process for pursuing civil action against Patricia. The case would be straightforward from an evidentiary standpoint, but it would likely take several months to resolve, and would probably result in some public attention that might embarrass both Patricia and Sofia. "Are you prepared for the possibility that this might become a public matter?" Robert asked. "Patricia moves in social circles where reputation is important, and she may try to discredit you or spin the story in a way that makes you look like a vindictive relative who can't accept her granddaughter's success." "Let her try," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my voice. "I have 20 years of bank records showing how I sacrificed to raise Sofia, and I have documentation of every penny I spent on her wedding. If Patricia wants to make this a public battle about who really supported Sofia's happiness, I'm prepared to present the evidence." That afternoon, I met with my financial advisor, Margaret Torres, to discuss the practical implications of the money that had been taken. The $67,000 that Patricia had redirected represented nearly my entire discretionary savings, and about 40% of my total retirement funds. The loss wouldn't leave me destitute, but it would significantly impact my financial security and limit my options for the future. The good news is that your basic retirement income from your pension and Social Security should cover your essential expenses, Margaret told me. But this loss eliminates most of your financial cushion and means you'll need to be much more careful about discretionary spending going forward. What if I can't recover the money through legal action? Then you'll need to consider some difficult choices. You might need to downsize your living situation, perhaps sell the house and move to something smaller and less expensive. You'll definitely need to eliminate any non-essential expenses and probably consider taking on some part-time work to rebuild your savings. The conversation was sobering, but it also strengthened my resolve to pursue legal action against Patricia. She had not only stolen my money and my credit for Sofia's wedding, but she had also jeopardized my financial security in my old age. The sophisticated woman who looked down on my working-class background had shown no hesitation in taking advantage of my labor and sacrifice for her own benefit. Over the next week, I threw myself into preparing the strongest possible case against Patricia. I organized every piece of evidence, contacted additional witnesses, and worked with Robert to develop a legal strategy that would maximize my chances of recovering the stolen money. But I also began preparing for the possibility that my relationship with Sofia was permanently over. I updated my will to remove her as my beneficiary, replacing her with charitable organizations that supported working women and children from broken homes. I changed my emergency contacts and my medical directives to remove any reference to Sofia or Marcus. Most painfully, I began the process of packing away the mementos and photographs that documented Sofia's childhood and our 20 years together. I couldn't bear to throw them away, but I also couldn't continue to live surrounded by reminders of a relationship that had been so thoroughly betrayed. The legal papers were served to Patricia on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Sofia's wedding. According to Robert, Patricia's attorney called his office within hours of receiving the documents, suggesting that Patricia was taking the matter very seriously and was probably surprised by the strength of the evidence against her. Sofia called me that same evening, and for the first time since the wedding, her voice carried real emotion rather than the distant politeness that had characterized our recent conversations. "Nana, what are you doing?" she asked, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Patricia said you're suing her over the wedding expenses. How could you do something like this? Are you trying to ruin my marriage?" "I'm trying to recover the money that was stolen from me," I said calmly. "If Patricia didn't want to be sued for theft, she shouldn't have taken my money without permission. She didn't steal anything. She helped organize the payments to make everything easier. You're turning a simple administrative matter into some kind of criminal conspiracy." "Sofia, $67,000 was taken from my account and transferred to Patricia's account without my knowledge or consent. In any reasonable definition of the term, that constitutes theft. But the wedding got paid for. Everything worked out perfectly. Why are you trying to destroy that now?" Her inability to understand the ethical problems with what had happened was even more frustrating than her refusal to acknowledge them. Sofia genuinely seemed to believe that the outcome justified the means, that as long as the wedding had been beautiful and successful, the methods used to achieve that success were irrelevant. "Sofia," I said, feeling exhausted by the conversation, "I'm going to ask you a simple question, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Did you give Patricia access to my banking information?" There was a long pause, and when Sofia finally spoke, her voice was defensive and angry. "I helped her consolidate some of the payments because she said it would be more efficient. I didn't know you would react like this. I thought you would be happy that everything worked out so well. So you did give her my banking passwords." "I helped her organize the finances because she has experience with these kinds of events, and she said it would prevent problems with the vendors. I was trying to make sure everything went smoothly." "And it never occurred to you that taking someone's money without their permission might be wrong, regardless of your intentions?" I wasn't taking your money. I was helping organize the payments so that everything would be coordinated properly. Patricia explained that high-end vendors expect to work with experienced clients, and she was just making sure that everything met their standards. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Sofia maintaining that she had done nothing wrong and that my legal action was a vindictive overreaction to what had been a reasonable administrative decision. She seemed genuinely unable to understand that theft doesn't become acceptable just because it's executed efficiently or because the stolen money is used for something worthwhile. When we hung up, I felt a profound sadness that had nothing to do with anger or betrayal. This was grief, pure and simple. I was mourning the loss of the granddaughter I had raised, the intelligent and ethical young woman who had been replaced by someone I barely recognized. But alongside the grief was a growing sense of liberation. For the first time in months, I was taking action to protect myself rather than simply enduring whatever treatment Sofia and Patricia chose to dish out. I was no longer the passive victim of their manipulation, and I was no longer responsible for managing their emotions or protecting them from the consequences of their choices. The legal process moved forward efficiently, helped by the clear evidence of financial manipulation and Patricia's inability to provide any reasonable explanation for her actions. Her attorney attempted to characterize the matter as a family dispute over wedding expenses, but the systematic nature of the transfers and the amounts involved made it clear that this was a case of sophisticated financial fraud. 3 weeks after the papers were served, Patricia's attorney called Robert to discuss a settlement. Patricia was apparently eager to resolve the matter quickly and quietly, without the public attention that a prolonged legal battle would inevitably attract. The settlement negotiations revealed just how worried Patricia was about the potential consequences of her actions. She was willing to return not only the money she had taken, but also to pay additional damages and legal fees to ensure that the matter was resolved without publicity. She's clearly more concerned about her reputation than about the money, Robert told me. This suggests that she has a lot to lose if this matter becomes public, which gives us significant leverage in the negotiations. I agreed to consider a settlement, but only if it included a full admission of wrongdoing and a public apology that acknowledged the theft and cleared my name. I also wanted assurance that Patricia would not attempt any further contact with me and would not interfere in any future relationship I might have with Sofia. Patricia initially balked at the requirement for a public admission of guilt, but when Robert made it clear that the alternative was a public trial where all the evidence would be presented in detail, she eventually agreed to our terms. The settlement was finalized on a Friday afternoon 6 weeks after Sofia's wedding. Patricia returned the full amount she had taken, plus additional damages that brought the total to nearly $80,000. She also signed a statement, acknowledging that she had improperly accessed my banking information and had stolen money that I had saved for Sofia's wedding. Most importantly, she agreed to send a written apology to everyone who had been at the wedding, explaining that she had incorrectly taken credit for expenses that had actually been paid by me, and acknowledging my role in making Sofia's celebration possible. Robert handed me the settlement check and the signed apology letter with a satisfied smile. "This is about as complete a victory as you could hope for in a case like this," he said. "Patricia has essentially admitted to everything and agreed to make full restitution. The public apology should also help clear your name with anyone who might have been confused about what really happened." But as satisfying as the legal victory was, it did nothing to address the deeper wound that had been inflicted. Sofia had not contacted me since our heated phone conversation 3 weeks earlier, and I had heard through mutual acquaintances that she was furious about the lawsuit and felt that I had deliberately tried to humiliate her new family. The public apology that Patricia sent out created exactly the kind of social embarrassment that she had been so desperate to avoid. The letter was formal but unambiguous, clearly stating that she had improperly taken credit for wedding expenses that had been paid by Sofia's grandmother and acknowledging that her actions had been inappropriate and hurtful. Within days of the apology being circulated, I began receiving phone calls from people who had attended the wedding. Many of them expressed shock and dismay at what Patricia had done, and several mentioned that they had always wondered how a retired nurse could afford such an elaborate celebration. The reaction from Sofia's college friends was particularly gratifying. These were young women who had known Sofia for years and who remembered me from various visits and family events. They had been surprised by my apparent marginalization at the wedding, and Patricia's admission helped explain what they had observed. I knew something was off. Sofia's former roommate Jessica told me during a long phone conversation. You raised Sofia practically single-handedly, and then suddenly at the wedding you were treated like some distant relative who had just shown up. Patricia's behavior makes a lot more sense now that we know what she was really doing. But while the public vindication was emotionally satisfying, it also created new complications. Sofia was reportedly mortified by the attention the situation was generating and angry that her wedding was being overshadowed by what she still characterized as a petty financial dispute. According to Jessica, Sofia had become increasingly isolated from her old friends as she threw herself into her new role as Marcus's wife and Patricia's protégée. She had joined several exclusive social organizations and had begun moving in circles where the people barely knew her background or her relationship with me. She's become someone I don't recognize, Jessica told me sadly. It's like she's ashamed of her past and thinks that if she reinvents herself completely, she can erase where she came from. But you can't build a real life on lies, and I think she's starting to realize that. The insight that Sofia might be struggling with her new identity gave me a brief moment of hope that perhaps she would eventually come to her senses and recognize what she had lost in her pursuit of social status. But as weeks passed without any contact from her, it became clear that she had chosen to double down on her new life rather than acknowledge the mistakes she had made. The money from the settlement allowed me to restore my financial security and even improve my situation somewhat. I paid off the remaining mortgage on my house and invested the remainder in conservative funds that would provide additional income during retirement. For the first time in years, I felt financially stable and independent. But the emotional cost of the victory was enormous. I had won justice and recovered my money, but I had lost the person who had been the center of my world. For 20 years, Sofia had chosen Patricia's sophisticated but hollow lifestyle over the authentic relationship we had built together, and there was no legal remedy for that kind of loss. I spent the next several months trying to build a new life that didn't revolve around Sofia and her needs. I volunteer at a local literacy center, helping adult learners improve their reading skills. I joined a book club at the library and began taking art classes at the community center. I even started dating again, something I hadn't done since my husband's death 15 years earlier. The new activities were fulfilling in their own way, but they also highlighted how completely my identity had been wrapped up in being Sofia's grandmother. For 20 years, every decision I made had been filtered through the question of what would be best for Sofia. Now, for the first time since she was 3 years old, I had to figure out what I wanted for myself. The process of rediscovering my own interests and desires was both liberating and terrifying. I had forgotten how to make choices based purely on my own preferences rather than on Sofia's needs or schedule. I had to relearn how to be Eleanor Hartwell, the individual, rather than Eleanor Hartwell, the devoted grandmother. One of the most surprising developments was the relationship I began with Thomas Chen, a widowed professor I met in my art class. Thomas was intelligent and kind, with a gentle sense of humor and a deep appreciation for literature and music. He had lost his wife to cancer 3 years earlier and understood the complexity of grief and the challenge of building a new life after profound loss. You know, he told me one evening as we sat in his garden sharing a bottle of wine, I think sometimes we become so focused on caring for other people that we forget we're allowed to have our own lives. It's not selfish to want happiness for yourself. His words resonated deeply with me because they captured something I had been struggling to articulate. For most of my adult life, I had defined myself through my relationships with other people. First as a wife, then as a nurse caring for patients, and finally as Sofia's guardian and grandmother. The idea that I deserved happiness and fulfillment independent of my service to others was both revolutionary and slightly frightening. Thomas had his own experience with family disappointment and betrayal. His adult children had moved across the country after their mother's death and rarely contacted him, despite his years of sacrifice to support their education and careers. He understood the particular pain of realizing that the people you love most are capable of casual cruelty when it serves their interests. The hardest lesson I've had to learn, he told me, is that love doesn't create obligations in other people. You can give everything you have to someone, and they're still free to walk away without explanation or apology. It's devastating when it happens, but it's also liberating once you accept it. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and shared experience rather than passion or desperation. We both understood that we were building something new rather than trying to recreate what we had lost, and that understanding gave us the freedom to be honest about our fears and limitations. 6 months after Sofia's wedding, I received an unexpected phone call from Marcus. His voice was tentative and formal, as though he were making a difficult business call rather than contacting his grandmother-in-law. "Eleanor, I hope I'm not overstepping by calling you directly," he began. "But I wanted you to know that Sofia has been struggling since the wedding, and I think some of that struggle is related to what happened between you two." I was surprised by his call and uncertain about his motivations. Marcus had never shown any particular interest in my relationship with Sofia, and I suspected that his loyalty lay entirely with his mother and her perspective on the situation. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure what you think I can do to help Sofia. She's made her feelings about me quite clear." "I know this is complicated," Marcus continued, "and I know my mother made some mistakes in how she handled the wedding planning, but Sofia loves you, and I think she's starting to realize that she may have made some mistakes too." His admission that Patricia had made mistakes was the first acknowledgement I had heard from anyone in the Whitmore family that their behavior had been problematic. But I was skeptical about Sofia's alleged regrets, given her complete absence of contact since the lawsuit was resolved. "Has Sofia asked you to call me?" I asked. There was a pause before Marcus answered. "Not exactly, but she's been different since the wedding, more withdrawn and less happy than I expected her to be as a newlywed. She doesn't talk about you, but I think that's because she misses you and doesn't know how to fix what happened." "Marcus, I'm going to be very direct with you," I said. "Sofia participated in stealing my money and then refused to acknowledge that anything wrong had been done. She allowed your mother to manipulate our relationship and rewrite the history of her upbringing. If she wants to repair our relationship, she needs to take responsibility for her choices and apologize sincerely for the harm she caused." "I understand that you're angry," Marcus said, "and you have every right to be. But Sofia is proud, and she's been influenced by my mother's perspective on things. Maybe if you reached out to her first, it would give her the opening she needs to apologize." The suggestion that I should initiate contact with Sofia after everything that had happened was both presumptuous and tone-deaf. Marcus seemed to believe that I should absorb the emotional cost of repairing a relationship that Sofia had deliberately damaged, simply because I was the older and supposedly wiser party. "Marcus," I said, "I spent 20 years putting Sofia's needs before my own, and I spent my retirement savings to give her the wedding she dreamed of. In return, she allowed your mother to steal credit for my sacrifices and then defended that theft when I objected. If Sofia wants a relationship with me now, she needs to demonstrate that she understands what she did wrong and that she's genuinely sorry for the pain she caused." "But she's your granddaughter," Marcus said, as though family relationships automatically superseded ethical considerations. "Doesn't that mean something?" It means everything, I replied. Which is why her betrayal was so devastating, and why her refusal to acknowledge it is so hurtful. Family relationships should be built on love and respect, not on one person's willingness to tolerate abuse from another. The conversation ended without any resolution, but it did give me insight into Sofia's current state of mind. If Marcus was accurately reporting her emotional condition, then perhaps Sofia was beginning to understand the cost of her choices. But understanding and genuine remorse were two different things, and I had no intention of making it easy for her to restore our relationship without taking full responsibility for what she had done. 2 weeks after Marcus's phone call, I received a letter from Sofia. The return address was handwritten in her familiar script, and my heart raced as I opened the envelope and unfolded the pages inside. The letter was 3 pages long, written on expensive stationery that probably came from Patricia's collection. Sofia's handwriting was careful and controlled, suggesting that she had drafted the letter multiple times before settling on the final version. "Dear Nana," it began, "I have been thinking about our relationship and the events surrounding my wedding, and I realize that there are things I need to say to you." The opening was formal and distant, lacking the warmth that had always characterized our previous correspondence. But I continued reading, hoping that the letter would contain the acknowledgement and apology that I needed to hear. "I want you to know that I never intended for you to be hurt by the wedding arrangements," Sofia continued. "When Patricia offered to help coordinate the payments, I thought it would make things easier for everyone involved. I didn't realize that you would interpret her assistance as something inappropriate or hurtful." The phrasing troubled me immediately. Sofia was describing Patricia's theft as assistance and characterizing my objections as an interpretation rather than a reasonable response to actual wrongdoing. She was maintaining the fiction that the financial manipulation had been a well-intentioned effort to help rather than a deliberate campaign to steal credit for my contributions. "I know that the lawsuit was difficult for everyone," the letter continued, "and I'm sorry that things escalated to that point. I wish we could have resolved our differences through private conversation, rather than involving lawyers and public statements." Again, Sofia was avoiding any acknowledgement of the underlying ethical problems with what had happened. She was apologizing for the consequences of my response to the theft, rather than for the theft itself, and she was suggesting that I bore some responsibility for the unpleasantness, because I had chosen legal action rather than accepting the situation. Quietly, the rest of the letter followed the same pattern. Sofia expressed regret about the deterioration of our relationship and claimed that she missed our regular contact, but she never acknowledged that she had done anything wrong or that her actions had been the cause of our estrangement. "I hope that we can find a way to move past this difficult period," she concluded. "I love you and I want you to be part of my life, but I also need you to understand that I'm an adult now with my own family and my own priorities. I can't go back to being the person I was before I married Marcus, but I hope we can find a new way to relate to each other that respects who I've become." The final paragraph was particularly painful because it revealed how completely Sofia had absorbed Patricia's worldview. She was essentially telling me that our previous relationship had been inappropriate because it hadn't respected her autonomy as an adult, and that any future relationship would need to acknowledge her superior status as a married woman in an elevated social circle. I read the letter 3 times, hoping to find some hint of genuine remorse or recognition of wrongdoing. But each reading only confirmed that Sofia had learned nothing from the past 6 months and was still committed to the narrative that portrayed her as a victim of my unreasonable expectations rather than as someone who had betrayed the person who loved her most. The letter was clearly an attempt to restore our relationship on Sofia's terms, without requiring her to acknowledge her mistakes or change her behavior. She wanted the emotional benefits of our connection without accepting any responsibility for the damage she had caused or making any meaningful effort to repair the trust she had broken. I set the letter aside and didn't respond immediately, Instead, I spent several days thinking about what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to have with Sofia going forward. The granddaughter I had raised was gone, replaced by someone who prioritized social status over family loyalty, and who was willing to rationalize theft and deception in service of her ambitions. But underneath all the disappointment and anger, I still felt love for the person Sofia had been, and grief for the relationship we had lost. The question was whether I could accept a diminished relationship with the person she had become, or whether trying to maintain any connection would only lead to further heartbreak. After much consideration, I decided to write back to Sofia, but my response was very different from what she had probably expected to receive. "Dear Sofia," I wrote, "thank you for your letter. I appreciate your desire to restore our relationship, but I need you to understand that words alone cannot repair the damage that has been done. You participated in a scheme to steal my money and give credit to someone else for my sacrifices. When I objected to this theft, you defended it and refused to acknowledge that anything wrong had been done. You allowed Patricia to manipulate our relationship and rewrite the history of your upbringing to minimize my role in your life. These were not mistakes or misunderstandings. They were deliberate choices that revealed a fundamental change in your character and values. The granddaughter I raised would never have participated in such deception, and she certainly would never have defended it when confronted with the evidence. If you genuinely want to repair our relationship, you need to start by taking full responsibility for your actions and acknowledging the harm you caused. You need to explain why you thought it was acceptable to give Patricia access to my banking information and why you defended her theft when I discovered it. Most importantly, you need to demonstrate through your actions that you understand the difference between right and wrong, and that you're committed to treating me with the respect and honesty that should characterize any meaningful relationship. Until you're willing to do these things, I see no point in pretending that we can simply move past what happened. I deserve better than a relationship built on my willingness to tolerate disrespect and deception, and you deserve the opportunity to become a person capable of genuine love and loyalty. I will always love the child you were and mourn the relationship we once had, but I cannot have a relationship with the person you've chosen to become unless and until you demonstrate that you're capable of the honesty and integrity that real love requires. I signed the letter simply Eleanor rather than Nana, a small but significant change that reflected the shift in our relationship. I was no longer willing to accept the role of unconditionally loving grandmother who absorbed whatever treatment Sofia chose to dish out. If she wanted a relationship with me, she would need to earn it through genuine remorse and changed behavior. Sofia never responded to my letter, which told me everything I needed to know about her priorities and her character. She had been hoping for a quick reconciliation that would allow her to feel better about herself, without requiring any real accountability for her actions. When it became clear that I wasn't going to provide that kind of easy absolution, she chose to maintain her silence rather than do the difficult work of genuine self-examination and apology. The months that followed were painful, but also liberating. I grieved the loss of the relationship I had cherished for 20 years. But I also began to appreciate the freedom that came from no longer being responsible for managing Sofia's emotions and expectations. For the first time in decades, I could make decisions based purely on my own needs and desires. My relationship with Thomas continued to deepen, providing me with companionship and emotional support during a difficult transition period. We traveled together, taking a cruise to Alaska and visiting art museums in major cities across the country. We attended concerts and theater performances, shared meals at restaurants neither of us had ever tried, and gradually built a life together that was rich and fulfilling. "You know," Thomas told me one evening as we sat on his porch watching the sunset, "I think sometimes the people we love most are the ones who teach us the hardest lessons about ourselves. Sofia taught you that you're stronger and more resilient than you knew, even if that wasn't her intention." His observation resonated with me because it captured something important about my journey over the past year. The betrayal and loss had been devastating, But they had also forced me to rediscover my own identity and worth independent of my role as Sofia's grandmother. I had learned that I could survive the loss of my most important relationship and even thrive in its aftermath. A year after Sofia's wedding, I received an invitation to Marcus's 30th birthday party. The invitation was formal and impersonal, clearly part of a mass mailing rather than a personal gesture. But it was also the first communication I had received from Sofia or Marcus since our exchange of letters 6 months earlier. I studied the invitation for several days before deciding not to attend. The party was being held at Patricia's estate, and I had no desire to subject myself to an evening in her company or to pretend that nothing had happened between us. More importantly, I wasn't interested in playing the role of the gracious grandmother, who had forgiven and forgotten Sofia's betrayal just to maintain appearances. Instead, I sent a polite note declining the invitation and including a modest gift card to a restaurant that Marcus and Sofia had mentioned enjoying. The gesture was courteous but distant, appropriate for acquaintances rather than family members. 2 days after the party, I received a phone call from Jessica, Sofia's former college roommate, who had attended the celebration and wanted to share her observations. "Sofia looked beautiful," Jessica told me, "but she seemed sad in a way that went deeper than just missing you. She kept looking around like she was waiting for someone who wasn't coming, and she didn't seem to be enjoying herself even though everything was perfectly organized." "Did she ask about me?" I found myself asking, despite my attempts to remain detached from Sofia's emotional state. "Not directly. But when people asked about you, she got this look on her face like she was in physical pain. I think she knows she made a terrible mistake, but she's too proud to admit it." Jessica's report confirmed what I had suspected. Sofia was beginning to understand the cost of her choices, but she was still unwilling to take the steps necessary to repair the damage she had caused. Pride was a luxury she could afford when she thought Patricia's world would provide her with everything she needed. But authentic happiness and meaningful relationships couldn't be purchased with social status or sophisticated lifestyle choices. "I feel sorry for her," Jessica continued. "She got everything she thought she wanted: the wealthy husband, the fancy lifestyle, the social connections. But she gave up the person who loved her most to get it, and I don't think any of the rest of it is enough to fill that void." The conversation left me feeling a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. I was glad to know that Sofia was experiencing consequences for her choices, but I took no pleasure in her unhappiness. The granddaughter I had raised deserved to be happy, but the person she had chosen to become had made that happiness impossible through her own actions. As the seasons changed and I settled more fully into my new life, I found myself thinking less frequently about Sofia and our lost relationship. The acute pain of betrayal gradually gave way to a duller ache of permanent loss, like the phantom pain from an amputated limb that never completely disappears but becomes manageable over time. I threw myself into my volunteer work at the Literacy Center, finding deep satisfaction in helping adult learners develop skills that would improve their lives and opportunities. Many of my students were women who had been held back by circumstances beyond their control: poverty, family obligations, lack of educational opportunities. Working with them reminded me of my own resilience and adaptability, and their progress gave me hope about the possibility of personal transformation at any stage of life. Thomas and I began discussing the possibility of marriage, a conversation that would have been unthinkable a year earlier when my identity was still so completely wrapped up in being Sofia's grandmother. But as I established my independence and rediscovered my own desires and preferences, the idea of sharing my life with someone who respected and valued me became increasingly appealing. "I never thought I'd want to marry again," I told him one evening as we planned a weekend trip to the mountains. "After my first husband died, I couldn't imagine caring about anyone else that deeply. And then Sofia became my whole world. And I thought that was enough." "But now?" Thomas asked gently. "Now I realize that love doesn't have to be desperate or consuming to be meaningful. We can choose to build something together without losing ourselves in the process. Our engagement was announced quietly, with a simple dinner party for close friends and a modest announcement in the local paper. I didn't invite Sofia to the engagement party, though I did send her a formal announcement along with the rest of the mailing list. She didn't respond, which no longer surprised or hurt me the way it once would have. The wedding planning process was a completely different experience from Sofia's elaborate celebration. Thomas and I chose a small ceremony in the garden of a local inn, with a simple reception for 30 close friends and family members. We made every decision together, based on our own preferences rather than on what would impress other people or meet external expectations. The contrast with Sofia's wedding was striking. Where her celebration had been about performing a version of sophistication and status, mine was about authentic joy and genuine connection with the people who mattered most to me. The flowers were simple but beautiful, the food was delicious but unpretentious, and the entire event felt like a true reflection of who Thomas and I were as individuals and as a couple. On the morning of my wedding, as I got ready in the small bridal suite at the inn, I found myself thinking about Sofia and wondering if she was happy in her marriage. The question no longer carried the emotional charge it once had, but I still felt a lingering curiosity about whether she had found what she was looking for in Patricia's world of sophisticated connections and social expectations. "Any regrets?" asked my maid of honor, a friend from the literacy center who had become like a sister to me over the past year. "None," I said, and realized that I meant it completely. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The ceremony was everything I had hoped it would be: intimate, meaningful, and joyful. Thomas and I exchanged vows we had written ourselves, promising to support each other's individual growth while building a shared life based on mutual respect and genuine affection. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with social expectations and everything to do with authentic love. During the reception, as I danced with my new husband and celebrated with friends who truly cared about my happiness, I realized that I had learned something valuable from the painful experience with Sofia. Love that demands you diminish yourself isn't really love at all, and relationships that require you to accept disrespect or deception aren't worth preserving. The granddaughter I had raised would always hold a special place in my heart, and I would always grieve the loss of that relationship. But I had also discovered that it was possible to build new connections based on honesty and mutual respect, and that those relationships could be just as meaningful and fulfilling as the ones that had come before. As Thomas and I prepared to leave for our honeymoon trip to Ireland, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this point. The betrayal and loss had been devastating, but they had also been transformative, forcing me to rediscover my own worth and teaching me that I deserved relationships built on genuine love rather than obligation or manipulation. Standing in the garden of the inn, surrounded by people who celebrated my happiness without reservation or ulterior motive, I understood that I had finally found what Sofia had been searching for in Patricia's world: a sense of belonging and worth that couldn't be taken away by other people's choices or actions. The difference was that I had found it through authenticity rather than performance, through self-respect rather than social climbing, and through relationships based on mutual regard rather than power dynamics. It had taken me 74 years to learn these lessons, but I was grateful for the knowledge and confident that the best chapters of my life were still ahead of me. As we drove away from the inn toward our new life together, I felt the last vestiges of anger and resentment fall away, replaced by a peaceful acceptance of what had been lost and excitement about what lay ahead. Sofia had taught me that even the people we love most can disappoint us in ways that change us forever. But she had also taught me that we have the power to choose how we respond to that disappointment, and that sometimes the best response is to build something new and better from the wreckage of what came before. The call came on a Tuesday morning 3 years after my wedding to Thomas. I was watering the herbs on our kitchen windowsill when the phone rang, and Sofia's name appeared on the caller ID. My heart no longer raced at the sight of it the way it once had. Time and distance had transformed the sharp pain of our severed relationship into something more like a faded bruise. "Eleanor," Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper, and I could hear tears in the single word. "I know I have no right to call you, but I don't know where else to turn." Despite everything that had happened between us, the anguish in her voice triggered an instinct I thought I had buried. "What's wrong?" "Marcus was in an accident last night. A drunk driver hit his TI car. He's been unconscious since they brought him to the hospital, and the doctors are saying there might be permanent brain damage." Her words came out in a rush, as though she was afraid I might hang up before she could finish. I closed my eyes, immediately understanding the terror she must be feeling. Brain injuries were unpredictable, and the waiting was agonizing for families who could do nothing but hope. "Where are you now?" "Presbyterian Hospital. I've been here for 16 hours, but Patricia and Marcus's father are on some cruise in the Caribbean." I keep asking the doctors questions, but I don't understand half of what they're telling me, and I'm so scared. The admission that she needed me after 3 years of silence created a swirl of complicated emotions. Part of me wanted to drop everything and rush to comfort her, but another part remembered the lessons I had learned about protecting myself from people who only valued me when they were in crisis. "Sophia," I said gently, "I'm very sorry about Marcus's accident. That must be terrifying. Will you come? I know I don't deserve to ask, and I know how badly I hurt you, but you always knew what to do when I was scared, and I can't do this alone." The request hung between us, weighted with years of history and heartbreak. Sophia was asking me to resume my role as her protector without acknowledging the damage she had caused or offering any explanation for her previous choices. "I'll come to the hospital," I said finally. "But I want you to understand that I'm coming as someone with medical knowledge who can help you navigate this crisis. I'm not coming as your grandmother, and I'm not pretending that everything between us is resolved." "I understand. Thank you." Thomas found me gathering my purse and keys. "Sophia?" he asked, reading my expression. I explained the situation, watching his face carefully. Thomas had supported my decision to maintain distance from Sophia, understanding that the relationship had become toxic. "Are you sure this is wise?" he asked gently. "You've worked so hard to build a life that doesn't revolve around managing Sophia's crises." "I'm not going as her grandmother," I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. "I'm going as a retired nurse who can help her understand medical information." The ICU waiting room looked exactly as I remembered from my nursing days. Harsh fluorescent lighting, uncomfortable chairs, and the pervasive smell of anxiety mixed with disinfectant. Sophia was curled in a corner chair, wearing wrinkled clothes. That suggested she hadn't left the hospital since the accident. When she saw me approaching, she stood quickly, and for a moment I thought she might try to embrace me. But something in my posture must have warned her off, because she simply said, "Thank you for coming." Over the next several hours, I helped Sophia decode medical terminology and understand treatment options. The doctors were cautiously optimistic that Marcus would regain consciousness, but they couldn't predict what neurological deficits might remain. When Patricia finally arrived from her cruise, perfectly coiffed despite her supposed urgency, she immediately began trying to take control of the situation. She suggested transferring Marcus to a more prestigious hospital, dismissing the current medical team's expertise. But something unexpected happened. Sophia, who had once deferred to Patricia's every suggestion, began pushing back. "The doctors here know his case," Sophia said firmly. "Moving him now could be dangerous, and I won't risk his recovery for the sake of appearances." I watched with fascination as Sophia demonstrated a strength I hadn't seen since her teenage years. The crisis had apparently awakened something that had been dormant during her years of social climbing. Over the following weeks, as Marcus slowly recovered, Sofia called me periodically with medical questions. Our conversations were professional and limited, but they revealed a woman who was rediscovering her own competence and judgment. 3. Months after the accident, Sofia asked to meet me for coffee. She looked different, less polished but more authentic, with the kind of groundedness I remembered from her childhood. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble. "Not just for calling you during the crisis, but for everything that happened before." "Sofia, please let me finish. I've been thinking about this for months." She took a shaky breath. "I knew exactly what Patricia was doing with the wedding finances. I gave her access to your banking information because I was ashamed of you, ashamed of where I came from. I wanted to fit into Marcus's world so badly that I was willing to steal from the woman who raised me." The brutal honesty hit me harder than I expected. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because during Marcus's accident, when I was truly frightened and needed real help, all the sophisticated connections Patricia had given me were useless. The only person I trusted was you. It made me realize what I had thrown away for the sake of appearances." Tears were streaming down her face now. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I understand what I did, and that I'm sorry for all of it. The theft, the lies, and especially for being ashamed of the woman who gave me everything." I studied the young woman across from me, seeing glimpses of the granddaughter I had raised alongside this newer, harder-won wisdom. "Thank you for telling me the truth," I said finally. "It helps to understand what really happened." "Is there any chance we could try again? Not the same relationship we had before, but something new and honest?" I considered the question carefully. The Sofia sitting across from me was not the same person who had betrayed me 3 years earlier. Crisis and consequence had transformed her in ways that seemed genuine and lasting. "Maybe," I said, "but it would have to be built slowly, on actions, rather than words." Over the following months, Sofia proved her sincerity through consistent behavior. She prioritized authentic relationships over social climbing, made decisions based on her own values rather than others' expectations, and treated me with genuine respect. The relationship we eventually rebuilt was different from what we had lost, more equal, less protective, grounded in mutual respect rather than my unconditional devotion. Sofia was no longer the center of my world, but what we created was real in ways our previous bond had never been. A year after our coffee meeting, Sofia hosted a small dinner party to celebrate my 77th birthday. As we sat on her apartment balcony afterward, she said, "I know I can't undo the damage I caused, but I want you to know how grateful I am that you left room for me to become someone worthy of your love again." "You were always worthy of love," I told her. "You just forgot that for a while." The journey had taught us both that redemption is possible, even after profound betrayal, but only through honest acknowledgement of wrongdoing and sustained commitment to change. The granddaughter I had lost was gone forever, but the woman she had become was someone I was proud to know and love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.